The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the swirling snow of Willow Creek, a frontier town clinging to the edge of the Wyoming territory like frost on a barbed wire fence. It was late December 1887, and the blizzard had come early this year, howling down from the Rockies with a vengeance that turned the world into a white shroud. Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking into the drifts that piled against the wooden sidewalks. She clutched her worn carpet bag in one gloved hand, the other pulling her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind bit at her cheeks, carrying the sharp scent of pine and frozen earth, but it was nothing compared to the chill she felt inside. She had come here with a fragile hope, answering an advertisement in the matrimonial news for a mail order bride. Mr. Harlan Whitaker, a prosperous rancher, had written letters full of promises: a warm hearth, a plot of land, a chance to start over. A woman of good character, his words had specified, to share in the building of a life. Eleanor had believed him, or perhaps she had needed to. At 28, she was no longer young by society's measure, and her past in Boston whispers of a broken engagement, a family scandal that left her ruined in the eyes of polite company, had driven her west. Here, she thought, the land was vast enough to swallow judgments, but as she approached the Whitaker ranch on the outskirts of town, hired buggy wheels crunching through the snow, doubt crept in like the cold, seeping through her seams. The house loomed ahead, a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, lamps glowing in the windows against the gathering dusk. Harlan met her at the door, a tall man with a mustache like broom bristles, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. No smile, no warmth, just a curt nod. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice rough as gravel. He didn't invite her inside, not fully. She stood on the threshold, snow melting off her hem onto the plank floor. "I've come as we agreed," she replied, her tone steady despite the tremor in her chest. She extended the bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, as if they were proof of her worth. He glanced at them, then back at her face, pale, freckled, framed by auburn hair pinned beneath her bonnet. "Letters don't tell everything, do they?" His gaze flicked to her figure, hidden under layers, but she knew what he sought: youth, beauty unmarred. "Word travels, even out here, about your circumstances back east." Eleanor's breath caught, a sharp pain like a needle prick. She had mentioned nothing of the scandal in her replies, hoping the distance would erase it. But gossip was a relentless traveler, faster than any stagecoach. "That was years ago," she said quietly, lifting her chin. "I've come to build something new." Harlan shook his head, stepping back. "I need a wife who'll be respected in town, not one folks'll whisper about. I'm sorry, but this ain't gonna work." He pressed a few coins into her hand, fare for the ride back to town, and closed the door with a finality that echoed in the storm. Alone now, Eleanor turned into the blizzard, the wind whipping her shawl like a flag of surrender. But she didn't cry. Tears would freeze on her lashes. Instead, she walked, each step a quiet defiance against the coldness of the world around her. The town ahead was a blur of lanterns in the whiteout, a place where she was a stranger, rejected before she could even unpack her dreams. Yet in her carpet bag, nestled among her few possessions, was a small quilt she had sewn during the long journey, patches of faded calico, stitched with threads of hope. It would have to be enough to warm her tonight. The snow deepened, and as night fell, a faint cry pierced the gale. Not the wind, but something human, fragile. There, half buried in a drift by the roadside, was a bundle, a Comanche infant swaddled in deerskin, abandoned or lost in the storm. Without hesitation, Eleanor knelt, scooping the child into her arms, her body heat seeping through to the tiny form. "Hush now," she whispered, tucking it beneath her shawl. "I've got you." The baby's dark eyes met hers, a spark of life in the frozen void. She pressed on toward town, the weight in her arms a new purpose amid the rejection. The blizzard had eased by morning, leaving Willow Creek buried under a heavy silence, the kind that muffled footsteps and made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Eleanor Hayes trudged through the snow-choked street, the Comanche infant cradled against her chest, now wrapped in her quilt for warmth. The baby was quiet, its tiny fingers curled around a fold of her shawl, as if claiming her. She had no name for the child, yet only a fierce resolve to keep it alive. Her own survival felt secondary, a distant ache beneath the weight of this new responsibility. The stagecoach driver had pointed her to the boarding house, a weathered two-story structure at the edge of town, its shingles sagging under fresh snow. The sign read Mrs. Tuttle's rooms, though the paint was peeling, and the porch creaked ominously under Eleanor's boots. Inside, the air smelled of lye soap and burnt coffee, and Mrs. Tuttle, a weary woman with eyes sharp as a hawk's, sized her up from behind a scarred oak counter. "Room's $1 a week," Mrs. Tuttle said, her voice clipped. Her gaze lingered on the bundle in Eleanor's arms, then flicked to Eleanor's plain wool dress and the carpet bag at her feet. "No trouble, mind. And what's with the Indian child?" "Found in the storm," Eleanor replied, her tone steady but soft, like thread pulled taut. "I'll care for it, Mrs." Tuttle's lips pursed, but she slid a key across the counter. "Upstairs. Last room on the right. No fires, no mess." She paused, then added, "Folks won't take kindly to that baby. Or to you, if you keep it." Eleanor nodded, the warning settling like frost in her bones. She climbed the narrow stairs, the wood groaning under her weight, and entered a room barely wider than a horse stall. A single iron bedstead, a cracked wash basin, and a window rattling in its frame against the wind. She set the carpet bag down and gently laid the baby on the bed, checking its warmth. The quilt, patched with scraps of her old life, a blue calico from her mother's apron, a red flannel from a dress she'd worn to a dance, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a small defiance against the grayness. She had no money beyond the coins from Harlan, no prospects, and a town already whispering about the ruined woman with a native child. The weight of it pressed against her chest, heavier than the snow outside. Yet as she sat on the bed's edge, the baby stirred, its soft coo breaking the silence. Eleanor's fingers traced the quilt's stitches, each one a choice to keep going. She would need to find work sewing, perhaps, or washing something to keep them both fed. The town might reject her, but she had survived rejection before. In Boston, they'd called her broken. Here, she'd be something else, something she'd forge herself. Outside, the wind moaned, carrying the distant clatter of a saloon and the crunch of boots on the street. Eleanor closed her eyes, the baby's warmth anchoring her. She was alone, yes, but not empty. The quilt, the child, her own stubborn heart, these were hers, and they would have to be enough. The winter sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting a pale, slanted light that barely warmed the frozen ground. Eleanor Hayes had been in town for a week, her days measured by the rhythm of survival. The boarding house room, with its sagging bed and frost-laced window, had become her sanctuary, though the walls seemed to whisper the town's judgment each time she stepped outside. The Comanche baby, whom she'd named Lily for the wildflowers she'd once seen in a meadow, slept in a cradle fashioned from a wooden crate, swaddled in the quilt that was now as much a shield as a blanket. Eleanor's hands, roughened from years of needlework, were her only currency, and she wielded them like a quiet rebellion against despair. She'd found work at the mercantile, mending clothes for miners and ranch hands who passed through. The shop's owner, Mr. Grayson, a gruff man with a limp, had agreed to pay her a few cents per piece, though his wife's sidelong glances made it clear she disapproved of Eleanor's situation. The townsfolk whispered as she walked by, her auburn hair tucked beneath a bonnet, Lily strapped to her chest in a sling. "That woman with the Indian baby," they'd mutter, their voices sharp as the wind cutting through the pines. Some called her reckless, others, worse. Her past, that shadow from Boston, clung to her like damp wool, but she refused to bow under its weight. Each morning, Eleanor sat by the mercantile's pot-belly stove, her needle flashing through torn shirts and frayed cuffs. The air smelled of tobacco and leather, and the clink of coins on the counter punctuated her thoughts. She worked with precision, her stitches small and even, as if sewing herself back together. Lily cooed softly, her dark eyes watching the dance of thread. The quilt draped over the sling was a patchwork of memory, each square a story, each seam a choice to endure. A blue scrap from her mother's apron, a gray one from her father's old coat. They held her together when the world tried to pull her apart. One afternoon, a woman in a starched dress paused by Eleanor's corner, her lips tight. "You're brave, keeping that child," she said, her tone more accusation than praise. Eleanor's needle paused, but she didn't look up. "She needed me," she replied, her voice soft but unyielding. The woman huffed and walked away, leaving only the creak of floorboards. Eleanor resumed her work, the needle's rhythm steadying her heart. She wasn't here to win their approval, she was here to live. By evening, her fingers ached, but her pocket held enough coins for bread and milk. She stepped into the dusk, Lily warm against her, the quilt catching the last light like a faint ember. The town might judge her, but each stitch, each day, was proof she wouldn't break. The mercantile's bell jingled softly as the door swung open, admitting a gust of cold air that carried the scent of fresh snow and pine resin. Eleanor glanced up from her mending, her needle poised mid-stitch over a rancher's worn shirt. It was mid-morning, and the stove's heat had begun to thaw the chill in her bones, though the town's whispers still lingered like frost on glass. Lily slept in her makeshift sling, the quilt's edges brushing Eleanor's lap, a soft barrier against the world. The man who entered was tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his coat dusted with snow that melted into dark spots on the floorboards. Thomas Reed, she would later learn, a widower who ran a small ranch a few miles out, raising cattle and tending a patch of land that had once been his wife's pride. His face was weathered, lines etched by sun and sorrow, but his eyes were kind, the color of weathered oak. He nodded to Mr. Grayson behind the counter, then scanned the shelves for flour and salt, his boots leaving faint tracks of mud as he passed her corner. His gaze caught on her work, the precise stitches pulling frayed edges together. He paused, not abruptly, but with the natural ease of someone noticing a well-tended garden amid barren fields. Eleanor felt his attention, a quiet weight, but it held no judgment, no pity, just a flicker of curiosity, as if he recognized the care in her hands. "You've a steady hand," he said, his voice low and unhurried, like the rumble of distant thunder. He gestured to the shirt. "That tear's been plaguing me for weeks." Eleanor met his eyes briefly, her own green ones steady despite the flutter in her chest. "It's nothing fancy," she replied, threading the needle anew. "Just making do." Lily stirred then, a small sigh escaping her lips, and Eleanor's hand instinctively smoothed the quilt over her. Thomas's gaze softened further, landing on the child without surprise or disdain. "She's got a fighter's spirit, sleeping through this cold." He didn't ask about the baby's origins, didn't probe. Instead, he turned to the counter, but not before placing a tin of peppermint sticks on the ledge near her. "For the little one," he murmured, almost to himself. "Or for you, if it suits." Eleanor watched him pay for his goods, the coins clinking softly, and gather his sacks. He tipped his hat as he left, the bell jingling again, leaving the air warmer somehow. She touched the tin, its cool metal a small anchor, and resumed her stitching. It wasn't pity in his eyes, she knew that look too well. It was respect, quiet and unassuming, for the way she held her world together with thread and resolve. That afternoon, as snow began to fall anew, Eleanor wrapped the quilt tighter around Lily and stepped out for air. The street was quiet, the flakes muffling sounds, but she felt less alone. Thomas's gesture lingered, a thread of connection in the vast white expanse. Days blurred into one another in Willow Creek, the winter's grip loosening slightly as January gave way to fleeting thaws, only to freeze again under starlit nights. Eleanor Hayes found a rhythm in her mending, her corner in the mercantile becoming a quiet haven amid the bustle of boots and barter. Lily grew stronger, her coos turning to tentative smiles that lit Eleanor's days like sunlight-piercing clouds. The quilt, now a constant companion, draped over the sling or spread on the floor during breaks, its patches wearing softer with use a map of endurance. Thomas Reed returned to the store more often than his ranch supplies seemed to warrant. At first, it was a sack of flour, then nails for a fence, each visit marked by a nod and a few words exchanged over the counter. He always paused by her station, his presence like a steady flame, warming without demanding. "Storm's coming again," he'd say, glancing at the window where snowflakes danced. Eleanor would look up, her needle pausing, and reply, "We'll weather it." No more, no less, but in those silences, something unspoken took root. One morning, as the stove crackled and the scent of fresh-baked bread from the bakery next door wafted in, Thomas set a bundle on the ledge beside her. Wrapped in brown paper, it was a small pouch of dried herbs, chamomile and mint, for tea. "Keeps the chill at bay," he murmured, his eyes on Lily, who reached a tiny hand toward him. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her, not from the stove, but from the gesture's simplicity. He didn't ask about her arrival in town, the rejection that still stung like an old bruise, or the whispers that followed her like shadows. He spoke only of the present, the cattle's health, the way the river iced over, the quilt's intricate patterns. "You're good with colors," he said once, tracing a finger lightly over a red patch without touching. "Reminds me of sunsets out on the range." Eleanor smiled faintly, threading her needle. It's just scraps pieced together. But her heart quickened at the way he saw the beauty in her making, not the brokenness others assumed. Their exchanges grew, subtle as the lengthening days. He'd bring a peppermint for Lily, or comment on the evenness of her stitches repairing his own coat. In return, she'd offer a quiet observation of birds' nests she'd spotted, or how the snow melted in patterns like lace. No declarations, no probing questions. Just a thread weaving between them, strong in its silence. One evening, as Eleanor bundled Lily and stepped into the twilight, Thomas appeared on the street, his horse tethered nearby. "Road slick," he said, offering his arm without fanfare. She took it, the contact brief but electric, like fabric brushing skin. They walked in companionable quiet, the quilt's fringe swaying, an emotional bridge forming in the spaces between words. Yet, unknown to her, riders had been sighted on the horizon, Comanche warriors, drawn by tales of a white woman who saved one of their own. The town buzzed faintly, but Eleanor, focused on the warmth beside her, remained unaware. February crept into Willow Creek, the snow softening to slush in the midday sun, only to refreeze by dusk into a brittle crust. Eleanor Hayes had grown accustomed to the mercantile's rhythm, the clatter of cans, the murmur of haggling, the warmth of the stove battling the drafty air. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, mending seams and patching elbows, each stitch a small act of defiance against the town's sidelong glances. Lily, now thriving, babbled softly in her sling, her tiny fingers tugging at the quilt's faded patches, which held stories Eleanor hadn't yet told her. Thomas Reed's visits had become a steady thread in her days, his presence as familiar as the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. He'd linger by her corner, commenting on the weather or the quality of her work, his words spare but weighted with care. She noticed how he never rushed, how his eyes held hers just long enough to feel seen, not as the ruined woman or the one with the Comanche child, but as Eleanor, whole in her own right. One frosty morning, as the mercantile hummed with early customers, Eleanor felt a restlessness in her chest. Thomas had brought her another small gift the day before, a skein of soft blue thread. For the quilt, he'd said, his voice low. The gesture had stirred something in her, a warmth that felt both dangerous and alive. She wanted to give something back, not out of obligation, but because her heart urged her to meet his kindness with her own. In the dim light of her boarding house room the night before, she'd worked late, her needle flashing under the flicker of a tallow candle. From scraps of muslin and a remnant of green calico, she'd sewn a small drawstring pouch, simple but sturdy, embroidered with a single sprig of sage, a nod to the herbs he'd given her. Now, as Thomas approached her corner with a sack of coffee beans in hand, she felt her pulse quicken. "Morning," he said, his oak brown eyes catching the light. He set the sack down and leaned slightly against the counter, watching her mend a pair of trousers. Eleanor took a breath, her fingers pausing. "I made something," she said, her voice soft but steady. She reached into her apron pocket and slid the pouch across the ledge. "For your tobacco, or whatever you carry." Her eyes flicked to his, then away, the gesture an emotional risk. Laid bare, the first hint of spring teased Willow Creek in late February, the air carrying a faint warmth that melted snow into rivulets along the muddy streets. The town's annual market day had arrived, a bustling affair where ranchers and farmers bartered goods under canvas tents, their voices mingling with the clatter of wagon wheels and the scent of fresh bread and smoked meat. Eleanor Hayes walked through the crowd, Lily nestled in her sling, the quilt tucked around her like a shield. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight beneath her bonnet, and though whispers followed her, the woman with the Indian baby, she held her chin high, her steps steady. She'd brought a small bundle of mended linens to sell, hoping to earn enough for a new pair of shoes for Lily, whose feet were outgrowing her swaddling. The market was a risk, exposing herself to the town's judgment, but Eleanor's resolve was stronger than her fear. She sat up at a modest table near the edge, her hands smoothing the quilt's patches as she arranged the linens, each stitch a testament to her quiet perseverance. Thomas Reed appeared through the throng, his broad frame parting the crowd like a plow through soil. He carried a crate of early carrots from his ranch, their green tops bright against his weathered coat. He spotted her table and approached, his oak brown eyes softening as they met hers. "Didn't know you'd be here," he said, setting the crate down nearby. His voice was low, but it cut through the market's din like a familiar melody. "Trying My luck, Eleanor replied, her fingers brushing the sage-stitched pouch he now carried, visible at his belt. The sight warmed her, a private thread in this public place. They stood together, not quite side by side but close enough that the crowd noticed. Mrs. Grayson, the mercantile owner's wife, paused mid-barter, her lips pursing. A cluster of women nearby whispered, their eyes darting from Eleanor's quilt to Lily's dark curls. Bold, showing up with that child, one muttered, loud enough to carry. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened, but Thomas stepped closer, his presence a quiet bulwark. Folks always talk, he said, his tone even, not for the crowd but for her. He picked up one of her linens, inspecting the stitches with deliberate care. This is fine work. I'll take two. He handed her coins, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a touch that felt like a promise. The whispers didn't stop, but Eleanor felt their sting less. She met Thomas's gaze, her green eyes steady, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the crowd. The quilt gleamed in the sunlight, its colors a defiance, and as Thomas lingered, offering to carry her unsold linens back to the boarding house, she sensed a shift, a transformation not just in her, but in how the world might see her, reflected in his unwavering respect, unseen by them. Dust rose on the horizon, riders approaching, their purpose unclear but heavy with intent. Thomas picked up the pouch, his callous fingers tracing the sage sprig's delicate stitches. A slow smile curved his lips, not wide but deep, like a river finding its course. This is fine work, Eleanor, he said, her name a quiet gift in itself. He tucked it into his coat pocket, his hand lingering there as if to hold the moment. Thank you, she nodded, resuming her stitching, the needle's rhythm matching her heartbeat. Outside, the wind carried whispers of approaching riders, but in that moment, the world was just the two of them, bound by a small, handmade thing and the unspoken promise it carried. March brought a tentative thaw to Willow Creek, the snow retreating to patches in the shadows of pines, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and budding sage. Eleanor Hayes sat on the boarding house porch, the evening sky a deep indigo pricked with stars. Lily slept inside, nestled in her crate cradle, the quilt draped over her like a promise kept. Eleanor's hands, idle for once, rested in her lap, her fingers tracing the calluses earned from months of mending. The quiet felt earned, a fragile piece after the market's scrutiny and the town's persistent whispers. Thomas Reed had walked her back from the mercantile that day, his steps matching hers along the muddy path. He'd carried her basket of linens, his silence a comfort rather than a void. Now, he appeared at the edge of the porch, his hat in hand, his coat unbuttoned to the evening's mildness. The lantern's glow caught the lines of his face, softening the grief etched there, revealing a man who carried his losses lightly but deeply. Mind if I sit? He asked, his voice low, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. Eleanor nodded, scooting to make room on the bench. The wood creaked as he settled beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of his shoulder, a quiet electricity in the space between them. They sat in silence for a moment, the stars above mirroring the unspoken words below. You've built something here, Thomas said finally, his gaze on the horizon where the last light lingered. Not just for the little one, but for yourself. Takes a strong heart. Eleanor's breath caught, her hands tightening in her lap. Some days, it doesn't feel strong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Boston, this town, they see what's broken in me. Thomas turned to her then, his oak brown eyes steady, unflinching. I don't see broken. I see a woman who stitches things whole clothes, lives. That quilt of yours. He paused, his hand resting on the bench, inches from hers. You've made this place better, Eleanor. You've made my days better. Her heart stuttered, the weight of his words sinking deep. She looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the widower or the rancher, but the man who saw her resolve, her quiet fight, her heart. You've been kind, she said, her voice trembling with the risk of truth. More than I expected, more than I thought I deserved. He shook his head, a small smile breaking through. You deserve more than you let yourself believe. His hand moved, covering hers gently, calluses meeting calluses, a touch that spoke louder than words. Under the stars, their fingers entwined. And when he leaned closer, his lips brushed hers, a kiss soft as spring, born of shared silences and mutual respect. As they parted, the night air carried a distant sound, hoofbeats faint but growing, a reminder of the riders drawing near. But for now, Eleanor held on to this moment, her heart open, No longer April unfolded over Willow Creek like a quilt smoothed across a bed, the hills greening with new grass, the river swelling with snowmelt. Eleanor Hayes stood outside the boarding house, her hands dusted with soil from planting a small garden patch beside the porch. Lily, now sturdy enough to sit propped against the quilt, babbled at a butterfly dancing over sprouting sage. The air smelled of earth and promise, a stark contrast to the winter's isolating chill. Eleanor's heart, once guarded like a locked trunk, felt lighter, opened by Thomas Reed's quiet presence and the kiss that had sealed their bond under the stars. Thomas arrived at midday, his wagon creaking under a load of fence posts and wire. He'd taken to visiting more openly now, his intentions clear to the town, though whispers still trailed them like dust. He stepped down, his boots sinking into the soft ground, and surveyed her garden with a nod. "Sag'll do well here," he said, his oak brown eyes catching hers. "Strong like you." Eleanor smiled, brushing dirt from her apron. "It's a start," she said, her voice steady but warm, the words carrying more than just talk of plants. They'd begun speaking of a future not in grand terms, but in practical ones, rooted in shared work and trust. Thomas had asked her to see his ranch, a modest spread with a cabin his late wife had loved. He spoke of it not as a shrine, but as a place waiting for new life. Together, they walked to his land that afternoon, Lily cradled in Eleanor's arms, the quilt draped over her shoulder. The cabin was sturdy, its logs weathered but sound, with a stone chimney and a porch facing the mountains. Thomas showed her the barn, the pasture, the patch where he planned to plant corn. "Needs work," he said, gesturing to a sagging fence. "But it's honest land. Room for a garden, too." Eleanor touched the quilt's edge, her fingers tracing a blue patch from her past. "I'd like that," she said softly. Then, meeting his gaze, she added, "I'd like to build here. With you." Thomas's face softened, a rare smile breaking through. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice low but sure. "We'll make it ours. No ring yet. No formal proposal, just a commitment as solid as the earth beneath them." Sealed with a nod and the weight of her hand in his. As they returned to town, the quilt catching the breeze, neither noticed the shadow on the ridge riders, now closer, their silhouettes sharp against the spring sky. A reckoning loomed, but for now, Eleanor and Thomas walked toward a shared horizon, their future taking root like the sage in her garden. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, painting the spring hills in hues of gold and sage green, the air alive with the hum of bees and the scent of blooming wildflowers. Eleanor Hayes stood on the porch of Thomas Reed's cabin, their cabin, now her hands smoothing the quilt draped over her arm. Lily, toddling now, chased a grasshopper near the garden, her laughter a bright thread in the quiet evening. The past months had woven Eleanor and Thomas together, their bond not sealed by a grand wedding, but by a simple vow spoken under the open sky, witnessed by the mountains and a handful of townsfolk who'd softened toward her resilience. This evening, the town had gathered for a barn dance, a celebration of spring's renewal. Eleanor wore a dress she'd sewn herself, blue muslin with stitches as fine as her mending, the quilt's colors echoed in its hem. Thomas stood beside her, his hand steady on hers, his oak brown eyes reflecting the lantern light. The fiddles sang, and though they didn't dance, they stood close, their silence a shared language deeper than the music. The townsfolk, once sharp with judgment, now offered nods of respect, some for her, some for the man who'd chosen her, and some for the story that had spread, the Comanche warriors who'd come, not with anger, but with gratitude, leaving gifts of woven blankets and a quiet blessing for the woman who'd saved one of their own. Days earlier, the riders had arrived at dawn, 100 strong, their horses stirring dust on the ridge. Eleanor had faced them, heart pounding, Lily in her arms, Thomas at her side. Their leader, a man with eyes like polished stone, had spoken in halting English, thanking her for saving the child Lily, a daughter of their people, lost in the blizzard. They'd offered no threat, only honor, and left as silently as they'd come. The town had watched, awed, and Eleanor's place among them shifted, her strength no longer questioned. Now, as the dance wound down, Eleanor and Thomas walked back to the cabin, Lily dozing against his shoulder. The quilt, spread on the porch bench, caught the last light, its patches, a tapestry of her past and present, Boston's pain, Wyoming's hope, love's quiet bloom. Thomas paused, his hand finding hers. "You reminded me who I already was," he said, his voice low, echoing her own unspoken truth. Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "And you me." They stood together, the night wrapping them in peace, their shared life a testament to dignity forged through perseverance and love.